Rabbi Geffen, help me out. These were the words with which one NSCI father greeted me last week on Rosh Hashanah. You see, his 12-year-old daughter was frustrated, shall we say, with having to be at services, if the only purpose was to make God happy. He attempted to explain that being here was not just for God, but also to help us be better people. She wasn't buying it. So I offered some backup, something rabbinic about how high holy days give us the chance to grow, that as people we're always evolving, we're always changing, like a tree, but we need to nurture that growth to make sure we become the best we can be. That's what the high holy days help us do. She listened to my response, she smiled politely, and then she shrugged her shoulders and walked away. 12-year-olds are tough. But over the course of the week, as I reflected personally on the question of why our presence here matters, I realized the actual answer proves of far greater consequence than my initial response. So Tessa, whose name I have permission to use, and anyone who's ever asked Tessa's same question, I'd like to give it another shot tonight. Consider for a moment the tone of our times, where so-called tolerance flourishes, but only in spaces of agreement. See something a different way? Step outside of that fixed boundary? Well, you're not welcome anymore. Whether it's closing our ears to words that trigger unpleasant associations, or the safe spaces that serve only to safeguard our feelings from being hurt. It seems there is no longer a singular, secure ground upon which we all can stand. As commentator David Brooks puts it, our world today is a culture of oversensitivity, overreaction, and moral panic, during which everybody feels compelled simply to go along. From classrooms to boardrooms and everywhere in between, gone are the social structures we always relied on for that gentle nudge of constructive criticism, the possibility of a different viewpoint, a place for the admission of wrong paths taken. And in their place, we find blame and bombast, offendedness and entitlement. My family experienced an extreme but increasingly common example of this when, on a flight home this summer, the captain came on the PA to announce that upon landing, the authorities would be boarding to arrest not one, but two different passengers who, one after being asked to put on a mask, and two after being asked to stop smoking marijuana in the bathroom, both verbally and physically assaulted the flight attendants. Are you shaking your heads? And although I'm sure most of us would never indulge that level of blind self-righteousness, we do nevertheless find ourselves in situations all the time where our own sense of entitlement or judgment against someone else takes over. From yard signs on neighboring lawns that align with a perspective we do not share, to the posts we read and write on social media about those other people. We make snap judgments, assuming we know everything there is to know about a person, just from a snippet of information. All too often, when a seat, any seat, at the table of judgment becomes available, we are all too happy to pull ourselves right up to it. But let's be honest. For all of our enthusiasm when it comes to impugning the repugnant offensiveness of others, we don't often have the stomach for it when that self-same judgment is directed back toward us. Judgment, however, is something none of us can ever escape. And I don't mean that in the theological Yom Kippur sense. More than any other societal force, it is judgment in some form that establishes the foundations upon which all tribes, groups, and nations exist. You may be surprised to know that ultimately cultures establish their moral frameworks solely by wielding one of two forces of judgment: shame or guilt. As Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory wrote on this matter, in shame cultures, if you've done wrong, the first rule is don't be found out. If you are, then bluff your way through. Only admit when every other alternative has failed, because you'll be disgraced for a very long time. But he continues, guilt cultures, on the other hand, make a sharp distinction between the doer and the deed, the sinner and the sin. That's why guilt cultures focus on atonement and repentance, apology and forgiveness. The act was wrong, but on our character, there's no indelible stain. Shame cultures exist to push the offender away. Guilt cultures exist to create a path for the offender to come back in. What kind of culture do you imagine Judaism to be? That's a good answer. I like that call out. I missed you guys so much. Look no further than the High Holy Days to see a system designed specifically as an all-out rejection of shame culture. In fact, throughout the entirety of its 3,000-year evolution, Judaism's purpose has been consistent: to remind each of us that no one is without flaw or failure. This notion is codified throughout the entirety of our liturgy. It's why at the beginning of the traditional Kol Nidre service, when just before we chant Kol Nidre, we ask permission to pray with the Avaryanim. Who are the Avaryanim, you might wonder? They are the sinners, the transgressors, those we'd otherwise be comfortable shaming away. But Kol Nidre's clarity comes and taps us on our shoulder to remind us of the deeper abiding truth. Guilt goes both ways. We are all Avaryanim this night. That's why we conclude Tavo Lefanecha with that declaration. We are not so arrogant and stiff-necked as to say before you, eternal God and God of all ages, we are perfect and have not sinned. Rather do we confess we have gone astray, we have sinned, we have transgressed. Or to put it in more relatable terms, as Rabbi David Stern invites us to ask ourselves, has there been a year in which I have not been impatient with people I love? Has there been a year in which I have not been judgmental of others without understanding their hearts? Has there been a year in which I have not failed to control my temper or my tongue, or failed to muster the courage to stand up more strongly for what is right? Shame from any of these failures might make us feel isolated or abandoned. But on this night, we all sit together in our guilt. On these high holy days, in this synagogue, or wherever you find yourself, not one of us stands apart or sits alone. Turns out Jewish guilt might just be the most benevolent force we have. And it all boils down to a simple childhood grammar lesson embedded in the vidui that confession we just joined together in a few moments ago. Notice the subject of every verb in the litany of offenses. Not I, but we. For the sins we committed against you. Asham nu, that nu means we. We embarrassed. We slandered others. In our collective confession of sins, which an individual might or might not have personally committed at all, we are actually engaging in a most selfless act, giving the priceless gift of sacred cover to others, to create a space safe enough for them to take the first steps on their own teshuvah journey. Think about that for a moment. This whole ritual could have been created differently. What if, before the reading of each sin, the clergy invited only those who had committed the sin to stand and read aloud? Who's standing up? Liars? Gossipers? How many would even give voice to the words? Rabbi David Stern again. It is a confession, not a survey. When we all recite every line, then only our own hearts know which sins have truly been our own. And Judaism whispers to us that our internal recognition may be enough to begin the path of return. This is actually what creating a truly safe space entails. You might be surprised to learn that safe space did not originate in the 1960s social justice movements, as is so often misreported. Instead, it began in 1940s corporate America with Kurt Lewin, a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany who also happened to be a founder of social psychology and management theory. Lewin was asked to develop leadership training to address the stagnation of business evolution and growth. Turns out at the time, corporate culture did not provide environments safe for employees to offer feedback and constructive criticism without fear of being fired. So Lewin and his team created what they called safe spaces, in which employees and managers could speak honestly with each other about working conditions and productivity goals without fear of retaliation or retribution. When members of the group felt they could freely participate in setting these goals, everything started to change. Of the most poignant note here is that those safe spaces were safe, not because they silenced critique, not because they avoided confrontation, but precisely because they encouraged it in a way that no one was put on the defensive or shamed. And in creating an environment like that, everyone felt a part of the better shared reality, and growth returned. Would you believe that the high holy days might just be the very last true safe space we have? And by coming together for them, we are the ones creating that brave space to nurture the best of our common humanity, apology, forgiveness, the restoration of relationships, and the sustainability of a community across lines of diversity. We aren't just doing this for God. We aren't just doing this for ourselves. We are here in service of one another. And that is a profound reminder that although the universe does not revolve around any single one of us, each of us has the incredible, unique power. We can create the environment for others' lives to change. What an immense act of defiance against the entitled currents of the world outside these walls. Think about this. It is your very presence here, now, this night, these days, that permits the healing of a relationship or even the saving of someone's soul. Our gathering on these days, creating and holding tolerant, truly tolerant space for one another, is not an effort limited to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rather, our gathering also serves as a training ground, helping us to strengthen our spiritual muscle memory, our generosity of spirit, our trust. Remember trust in our fellow human being, so that we might do this most holy work in all the spaces of our lives, not just here in our safe sanctuary, but also out there in the big, loud, real world. This is why our presence here matters. With practice, we can teach our hearts to sense the isolation, fear, and despair of others that our ears and eyes are unable to perceive. We can heal the brokenness in each other's hearts with our own. And Tessa, I'm pretty certain that there is nothing more desperately needed in our world than that. Gemar Chatima Tova. May we be inscribed and sealed, all of us, for goodness, kindness, and blessing in this new year.